good day. This is Chuck Hardwick Jr., and I'm on a Zoom call with my dad, Chuck Hardwick Sr. I'm in my home office in the Ocean Beach neighborhood of San Diego. My dad is in his home in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. Today is May 29th, 2020, and welcome to episode 11, the Reagan years. How are you today, Dad?
Chuck, I'm doing fine. I sure hope that you are too.
I'm doing okay, and as well as can be expected. And so before we get started with episode 11, kindly tell us your thoughts on what's happening with the pandemic and how it's affecting you personally.
Well, as you know, Chuck, I lost my brother David to the virus, and it was very sad. It was not a total surprise, but it was a shock. But what I wanted to report on was how meaningful I found the virtual wake that we had with the family on Zoom. After he was buried, only 8 people could be at the burial site. So the immediate family was there. But then the rest of the family joined in for an hour, hour and a half of music and prayers and conversation. And I found it comforting, actually. And I think Rosie, his wife, and Sandy and David, his 2 children, and others did as well. So there's a lot of suffering in the pandemic. America will go on, though.
Well, very well said. Yeah, it was a sad Zoom call, but I'm glad that we were able to at least do what we could regarding showing some support for the family, but very well said. So in the last episode, we had just talked about how you had won as state assemblyman. And so now we're going to move on from then. And so after you won, what was kind of your first priority as a new freshman state assemblyman?
Well, you may or may not remember, but your mother and I went to Bermuda for a holiday. We were all exhausted. So after we came back, the first priority was to really thank people. I had so many people to thank who worked very hard. Certainly you and your mom. The rest of the volunteers were just terrific. It was really a meaningful thing. It was a great honor. And so setting out to thank people, including Pfizer. Our chairman, CEO, who I explained in an earlier episode, who set a new company policy encouraging people to run for public office. It was really a breakthrough, and other companies followed suit. So I had a lot of people to thank, but another group I had to thank were from the Republican National Committee, because New Jersey and Virginia are the 2 states that have what are called off-year elections. So 76 was a regular year, 77 was an off year. So I had the local election group in New Jersey. They selected some candidates that they thought had a chance of winning, would be responsive, and I was lucky to be one of their targeted races. They were great, and many of them remained friends and ended up years later in my gubernatorial campaign. For example, they brought some ideas. One idea that I really remember was called the wife letter. And the wife letter was ostensibly written by your mother, and it was like a handwritten letter. Of course, it was all printed on machines, but it looked handwritten, and in, I think, blue paper and some kind of light blue ink. The envelopes were all hand addressed, first class postage, and mailed out to voters. And I got a lot of good feedback on that. People opened them. And the hard thing to get about political literature is to get them to open it in the first place. But people opened that. Sometime later, after I was elected, I was at an event in Cranford, and a woman, I was introduced to a woman, she said, "You're Chuck Hardwick. I am still mad at you." And I said, "I'm sorry, what did I do wrong?" She said, "My husband was on a business trip, and a letter came addressed to him in a woman's handwriting. And it was sealed at first class. And so I put it up on the mantle, waiting for him to come home. And he finally came home, and I said, you go over to the mantle and open that letter, and I want to read it." He said, "Okay." And he opened it up. "That is your political letter. I was so mad at you because of all the anguish it caused me." That's in politics, you can never tell what's going to work well and what isn't going to work well. But they taught me a lot of other things. Fundamentals, blocking and tackling, you might call it, how to really do door-to-door campaigning, helped on the literature. So the RNC was a lot of help. And they later invited me to Washington to speak to donors and potential donors on how they helped me. So hoping people would give more money to, so other people could be helped. So it was really a good experience. I had a lot of people to thank. And I learned you can't really thank volunteers too much. You can thank them 20 times and no volunteer that I recall in all my campaigns, and I ran 7 times, ever said, "Oh, don't thank me again. You've thanked me already." People like to be thanked, and they deserve it.
People do like to be thanked. That's very insightful. So let's see, you won the election that was on your birthday in 1977. And then, so presumably, were you sworn in January of 1978 or?
Yes.
Okay. And so tell us about the complexion of politics in Trenton. Was there a Democrat in power as governor? Who controlled the House? Who controlled the Senate? What was it like as a freshman there politically for you?
Well, Brendan Byrne was reelected in 77. He'd been elected in a landslide in 73 because of Watergate. He was reelected, and also they had a referendum passed for casino gambling. They promised senior citizens that if it were passed, it would pay for their pharmaceutical program, and the money would all be dedicated to seniors and maybe something in education. I'm not sure exactly. And so as it turned out, the money from casinos was dedicated to seniors, but then they reduced funding elsewhere for seniors. So there really wasn't much of a net gain. And there was still resentment about the income tax. So it was a kind of contentious thing. But I had so much to learn. It's a highly partisan environment. And we were in a very minor minority. I think that there were 54 Democrats and only 26 Republicans. So we had almost no say about anything. They overwhelmed us on committees and all the votes. And we could only get bills on rare occasions. If you had a bill that was so good that they had to pass it, then they would consider passing it. I had a couple like that over the years. And a lot of the bills would not be passed unless the Democrats had what they would call an emergency. And later, we Republicans, when we were in charge, we did the same thing. So some bill that maybe they didn't even go to the committee and maybe not highly controversial, but they wanted it, they'd say, okay, it's an emergency, we need 60 votes. So we need 6 Republicans to vote for this bill. And the Republican leaders say, fine, we'll vote for it, but here are the bills we want in return. We want these 3 in return. So there'd be negotiating back and forth. I remember once later on a bill that I'll talk about, I put up, it's actually had to do a strip search, really a good bill. I remember I was in a minority, and the majority leader, John Paul Doyle, came over and he said, "You have this strip search bill?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, what I want to know is, do you really want the legislation, or do you just want the credit?" And I remember saying, similar to Doyle, majority leader, "I want both. I want the legislation and I want the credit." He said, "Well, if you don't care about the credit, we can put in a Democrat bill and pass it just like that." I said, "Well, I'll wait a couple of days and wait and pass my bill." So I did, and he did, and the bill was eventually passed. But that's the environment. And it's often criticized, the partisanship is. But partisanship has a really important role. I do support the idea because who else can really watch the majority better than the minority? I mean, we Republicans in the minority had every reason to find fault, if we could, legitimately, with what was being proposed. And if we could stop a bad idea or slow down a good idea to get our own bills used, that was the game that was played. I remember once, it was really a good piece of legislation. It was to create the New Jersey Transit Authority, which you could argue hasn't worked out too well over the years. But it was in committee, and my memory was that I think there were 7 members of a committee, and it was 4 Democrats or maybe 5 and 2. I don't remember the exact makeup. But there was a lot of lobbying against it by private bus companies. And one of the Democrats had some private bus companies who would be put out of business because the state would run all the buses. Essentially, that was the idea. And he was reluctant to support it. And he didn't want to support it. And the committee meeting went on and on. And of course, we Republicans were happy to see this because it was a Brendan Byrne proposal, big proposal, very controversial. We wanted to get something out of it. And so the committee went on, and we had sandwiches brought in. And the governor's representative was there pushing the Democrats. They couldn't push us. We're pushing the Democrats for the bill. finally, sometime after lunch, I won't mention his name, but the guy said, all right, I'm supporting the bill. And someone said, oh, wow, what made you change your mind? The governor's office? He said, no. He said, the Republicans didn't share their sandwiches. So bad way to only know we would bought him as many sandwiches as he wanted, but that's just human nature. That shows you the way the world works.
People get impatient when they're hungry. That's pretty funny. Now, at this time, you were still working at Pfizer. How did you manage to do your job at Pfizer and your activities in this quote unquote part-time job as an assemblyman?
Well, that's a good question. Had it worked out pretty well, we're fortunate that New Jersey geographically is a fairly small state. I knew on session days, we weren't getting a lot of notice, but we knew on session days what time the assembly, or if we were on a committee, if our committee was going to meet. So my routine, I was allowed one day a week off for serving. I'd get up early in the morning, take a train into New York, Penn Station, walk up to the office, and it's amazing how much work you can get done in a half day when you know you've only got a half day. So I would get all my meetings done, get everything in order, and then leave, walk across town or take a subway back to Penn Station, take a train to Trenton, do Pfizer work on the train, be met at the train station by a legislative aide who would then drive me to the State House, wasn't far away, attend the committee hearings, attend the session, and they often ran late into the night, and then drive home and be there for the day. So I was able to make that work out pretty well.
Well, wait, how did you drive home? If you took the train from New York to Trenton?
My legislative aides would drive
okay.
and meet me and then drive me home. I didn't drive myself usually.
Well,
but I went with, to remember the environment. I had been president of Calvary Lutheran Church, been active in the social affairs outreach, bringing speakers in during the Sunday school hour. And our pastor there was very engaged in political and social issues. So the Council of Churches had a big conclave of issues and came back with a major report. And there were 3 issues that they felt had a moral persuasion to them. One was on gambling. It had already been enacted into law, but how it's going to be implemented became very important. Another was deplorable conditions on county jails, which were real. They had a report prepared on that. And the third one was their opposition to capital punishment. So I was armed with their research and backup by the church community on those issues. And the first one that I decided to undertake, I approached the speaker and a committee chairman and said, look, I'm really interested in working on the standards in our county jails. Is this something that you would allow me to do, that you would support? And their attitude, I remember, was, oh, a Republican to take on an unpopular political issue, one that we don't want to touch? Yeah, feel free, go for it. And I did. And they appointed me to chair a subcommittee on county jails or something like that. I held some hearings at gave the county churches, council of churches, a platform to air the improvements that they thought should be made, issued a report, and some proposed legislation. And that was one of my first really trying to get how the wheels of government could work, how to bring in outside influences. And then that set the stage for later on the work that I did on gambling, which I'll go into more detail a little later.
So as someone that is running on a 2-year term, you're almost immediately running for re-election for the following cycle. And I'm sure you had a strategy or wanted to get some good press and be in the media. What was your first big thing that you worked on that maybe got you some good press?
Well, I mentioned that there were bills that were so good that they felt they had to pass. And one of them was a bill to require the Department of Transportation to permit people to say whether or not they were an organ donor and put it on their driver's license. And it was an idea I picked up from other states. It was not my original thinking. I thought, well, New Jersey doesn't have that, and we should. And so I had the legislation. It did pass, and Governor Brendan Byrne, gave me a public signing, which was fairly unusual for a Democrat to do that for a Republican. The picture you're showing there was very good publicity. It was a very good bill. And by running that public signing, it drew attention to the issue that organ donors were needed. And years later, I paid the governor back with a big favor when I was speaker. And there was a movement afoot to change the name of the Byrne Arena to something else. And boy, he really wanted that Byrne Arena name to stay. He had a big joke about people thought they thought he was Italian because his last name was Arena. But I knew if I posted the bill had been introduced. If I posted it for a vote, it would have passed. And if it passed, Governor Kane would have signed it. So I just let it sit there unless the pressure ever really built to pass it, and then it didn't happen. So he appreciated that.
Really interesting. And then at one point you endorsed a very conservative guy named Jeff Bell, who ran in, I think, was it the 78 Senate campaign against Clifford Case? And then Bell won right in the primary, but then lost to basketball legend Bill Bradley, as I recall. How did you happen to endorse Bell back then?
Well, I was proud to endorse Jeff Bell. My initial motives were a little suspect, I guess. I remember after being elected, being in Washington, and going to Senator Case's office and requesting a sit down about some issue. I don't remember what the issue was. And I was probably feeling my self-importance of being a member of this assembly, and gee, I'm an important guy, I like to see the senator. And his staff totally blew me off. I felt that personally insulted, and also felt that that was an insult to the people I represented. And then I found out that Jeffrey Bell was running against him in the primary. So I endorsed Jeff Bell. So that's not really a good reason to do it, but I got to know Jeff Bell, and it became a good reason. He was really a great American. And I was the only elected official to endorse Jeff. I handed out literature for him. Remember down at the train stations in New York, people taking the train back to New Jersey, campaigned for him. And he ended up losing to Bill Bradley, as you said. And I think that night, I remember seeing him and his wife there. And I think it was the first time that tears came to my eyes over anything that was political. He ran a good race, but Bill Bradley then went on to serve with distinction, no doubt. My next contact with Jeff was Jeff called me and said, look, this was in 1980. Ronald Reagan, Governor Reagan, is running for president. I'm supporting him. He's a good conservative. I want you to come in New York, and you're in New York, you're working, etc. So I ended up endorsing Reagan at Jeff Bell's urging. That was a lot of fun. I remember that. And then Reagan started to gain momentum, and we had a county committee convention. And Westfield was going to, the Republican leaders in Westfield got together, and they were going to decide who they were going to support at the county convention. Because whoever won the county convention would then get a lot of votes, plus that would select the delegates to go to Detroit for the actual convention, national convention. So I remember being in the screening, and the Bush chairman, Barbara Clayman, who had been a supporter of mine, but then she went for Bush while I was with Reagan, had a candidate to run to be a delegate. And her pitch was, well, Chuck Hardwick's an assemblyman. He's gotten enough. We ought to have a volunteer. This woman's a volunteer. Volunteers need to be appreciated, recognized. We should send a volunteer to Detroit to be a delegate. She deserves it. So I was presented with that issue. And I said, I agreed 100%. I said, I will step aside and support this person if she will support Reagan as a delegate. But she said, well, I can't do that. I would be a Bush delegate. So my argument back, I said, well, okay. Back to the Westfield Republican Committee was, well, if you want Reagan, which I suspected they did, you should support me. If you want Bush, you should support her. So we got Western, so they supported me. So I went to the county convention campaigning for Reagan. Jack Kemp came in and worked with me. Some of the young Bush guys came in. I think they were, I'm trying to remember who Bush got. It was his sons, came in to campaign for Bush. I carried arrows from that Reagan Bush contest that I backed for a long time. But Reagan won the county convention. So I was elected to be a delegate to Detroit, along with my friend Earl Henwood, who I talked about earlier, and the county chairman, Alpizano, and another former county chairman, Dick Hatfield. So we went to Detroit. It was an amazing experience to be at the convention. The first day there, they took a picture of the four of us and someone else, I've forgotten who else, and that was a Saturday. And on the front page of the New York Times was everybody but me, and the photo editor, I guess I was awkward on the edge, that cut me out. I was pretty disappointed. The next day, I met George Thames, who was New York Times White House photographer. And he saw me, he said, "You didn't make the cut." He said, "I'm sorry." And he took some more pictures of me, which they never, the Times never ran those either. But I had the most amazing lunch with him because he'd been covering the White House since the days of FDR. And he told me stories, and one story he told me, an amazing story. Most people who would see this video are familiar with the photograph called "The Loneliest Job in the World." And it's a picture of President Kennedy, very pensive. It's a back shot. He's got his fingers, he's in the windowsill, looking down. Looks like he's in meditation. It's called "The Loneliest Job in the World." But Mr. Thames took that picture, and he told me how he took it. He said it was a scheduled shoot for the president of the White House. And he opened the door and said, "Good morning, Mr. President." He said, "I've got my camera and I'm taking pictures. And how are you today?" And he said something like, "Good morning, Thames. I'm reading that bullshit newspaper of yours." And he said the president was over there actually doing isometric exercises in the windowsill. He wasn't pondering any great issues at that moment, but he had his comments about the times. And you may or may not know that for a while, JFK wouldn't let the New York Times be delivered to the White House. So President Trump is the first president who has his battles back and forth with the Times. But being at the convention was an absolute amazing experience. I saw all the work come together, saw the people from around the country, the media. I remember Leslie Stahl from CBS interviewing me on the floor of the convention. I forgot what she was either asking me about Bush being a VP and his stand on abortion, or she was talking about President Ford running with Reagan because there was some movement afoot that there might be a Reagan-Ford ticket and share the presidency or something, but that idea was dropped. Clearly Bush was selected. And I remember being on the floor with the balloon drop. Reagan gave this terrific speech, which if I remember correctly, he started with, or ended it with a moment of silent prayer. I said, "God bless America." Now, when that man prayed, I think you knew he was really praying. He wasn't just using religion on his sleeve in one way or another. But it was a fantastic experience. I was proud to be part of it, remember to my dying days. And then your mother and I were invited, of course, to the inauguration. That was great. It was a really cold time. I remember how cold it was in Washington, but we saw Ray Charles and a lot of celebrities and had a lot of fun. Enjoyed the parade. It was quite a great experience.
So the work you did campaigning for Ronald Reagan, it paid off for you with an appointment. Tell us about that appointment.
Well, what happened was then in 1981, I had a good relationship with the RNC, and I was in San Francisco, I think it was San Francisco or LA, someplace in California, on a Pfizer business trip. And while there, I understood the RNC was having a meeting of some kind with state legislators. So I found time, I went to that meeting, and while there, they said, we're forming a new organization, the National Republican Legislators Association. It will be an ex officio part of the Republican National Committee. And so I attended the meeting, and the same people who were running that were people who ran my campaign back in New Jersey in '77. So we already knew each other, and they kind of maneuvered for me to be elected president of the National Republican Legislators Association. That was a lot of fun. And that then put me in a position, I enjoyed attending the Republican National Committee meetings, which was great. And it put me in a position then that President Reagan appointed me to be a member of the Presidential Advisory Committee on Federalism. So big debates were underway back then on the role of federal versus state versus local governments. So after being on the National Republican Legislators Association and then on the Federalism Committee, I was in a really good position to support the presidency and his proposals when they were before like the National Conference of State Legislatures. I would marshal other state legislators to get behind the Reagan proposals. The Federalism Advisory Committee was composed of 5 people from Congress, 5 governors, 5 state legislators, 5 mayors, and 5 county officials, if I remember correctly. Vice President Bush was on there. It was chaired by Paul Laxalt, who was a really good friend of the president's. And Governor, then Mayor Voinovich of Cleveland, Mayor Koch of New York, and a lot of other really interesting people to work with. So I enjoyed that committee very much.
Well, it sounds like, too, making all these national political contacts couldn't have hurt your position at Pfizer as someone just knowing more people throughout the country. Sounds like that may have helped your career at Pfizer a little bit as well. Is that true, or what do you think about
Well, it certainly, that's a good point. It certainly didn't hurt. It took me a bit out of the running for another internal Pfizer promotion, because I wasn't there all the time, and they knew I had a lot of priorities in politics. But on balance, I think in the long term, by being in the legislature, it helped me at Pfizer, as well as being at Pfizer, helping me in the legislature. I remember at Christmas it's a very heady experience what I was doing. And one Christmas Eve, I think it was in '81, got a phone call, please hold on for President Reagan. So he was calling to wish me a Merry Christmas. Well, that's heady stuff. I enjoyed that a great deal. And I see you're showing a picture there. That was with my good friend, Paul Coverdell, who was a state leader, state senator in Georgia, who was very good friends with Vice President Bush. And this was a meeting in it's called the old Executive Office Building then. I'm not sure what it's called now. With Paul Coverdell, who later then was appointed by Bush when he became president to be director of the Peace Corps. And then after that was elected the United States Senator from Georgia. And then tragically died of a brain hemorrhage at a very, very young age.
And then you also had the experience of flying on Air Force One. What was that like?
Well, I did. The National Conference of State Legislatures had its annual meeting in Atlanta. Oh, I see you're showing my place card. I took that with me in the limo with the president and had him autograph it. As you can see, it's getting a little faded, but it was a very fun experience. The president of the NCSL was Republican Senator Ross Doyon from Kansas, and he and I were in Washington. We'd gone up the night before. We were picked up at the hotel and taken to the White House to then get ready for the trip for Air Force One. Well, the president left by helicopter, and we left earlier. We were being driven when by the Secret Service agent and a young woman who was secretary to Jim Baker, who was assistant to the president. Well, we got to Andrews Air Force Base, and the gate was closed. And a Secret Service agent was standing there with his arms folded and said, "No, you can't go in." And this Baker's secretary, we saw Air Force One out on the tarmac, jumped out of the car, or I think it was actually an SUV of some kind that they had, jumped out of it and said, "You can't leave. These two men are supposed to introduce the president in Atlanta. You can't leave." And so they were talking up their wrists and everything. And so the gate opened, our vehicle moved in. They opened up the door and said, "Move it." So we both ran. We had briefcases. We ran down. Air Force One was out on the tarmac, the mobile thing that you walk up the steps, was pushed back up, the door opened. We ran up the steps and jumped in and got on Air Force One. And so then they waited for us for a bit, probably a minute or two. I'm not sure exactly. That was fun. First time I ever use a phone on an airplane. And I remember going into the back of the lavatory, and I was startled. There was a whole section of the plane with Secret Service guys. They had the machine guns out and Tommy guns, all kinds of weapons. What's this going on? First time I was in a restroom on a plane that had cloth hand towels. You don't have to wash your hands. You had cloth towels. I was impressed by the little things. Jim Baker came out then and introduced himself, said he'd read our bios, and that was cool. So we got to Atlanta, and then Ross Doyen and I got into the presidential limo, along with Rich Williamson, who was assistant to the president, later became an ambassador. And we started driving to Atlanta, to the convention center. And while we were driving, the president kept leaning over, and he was waving at people like that. And he said, "Excuse me," he said, I know this is kind of disruptive or something, but he said, "When I was governor, I remember riding with the President of the United States, and the great American people were lined up the side of the roads to wave at the car. They waited there a long time to see us go by. And he wouldn't wave at them or anything. He was so intent on telling me stuff." And Reagan said, "I thought then, if ever I'm the President of the United States, I'm not going to keep the great American people waiting. I'm going to wave to them." And so he said, "I always do that." So that was Reagan in action. And he told us some stories about students demonstrating against him when he was governor because they were on strike and all that. So I was seated knee to knee with him. It was really a memorable experience that I enjoyed greatly. And then a picture you showed earlier was that same Air Force One, now in retirement at the Reagan Museum. It was fun to take Sheila and Austin and show them the plane that, there's a picture of the three of us, to show them the plane on Air Force One that I had traveled on.
Yeah, I remember that well. After you were visiting me in Ocean Beach, you drove up there for that. And then the other memory I have was I must have been in high school, and the phone rang in our kitchen on Dixon Drive, and I answered the phone, and it was you calling me from Air Force One. So I thought that was pretty cool to get a call from my dad on Air Force One. Anyway, it was just a strong memory, and what a cool experience to have had that chance to have that much quality time with Ronald Reagan and to fly on Air Force One. That's really pretty cool, Dad.
Well, it was cool. And I was invited back for bill signing. I interacted with him on the Federalism Advisory Committee. I had the honor of being with him on a number of occasions, and he was truly an inspiration. In the meantime, my legislative agenda was moving ahead. I had done a great deal of research on the whole issue of credit being extended to gamblers, and especially problem gamblers. A man by the name of Arnie Wexler, who was leading that issue on a national basis, approached me and said, "There's so much that needs to be done on gambling." And I said, "Well, Arnie, you and I working together, I think we can do something." And I see you're showing a clip of a clinic that was open for addicted gamblers. I started attending with Arnie Gamblers Anonymous meetings, and I found out that one casino, the Sands, invited me to come down on Saturday and spend the day with a credit manager, thinking I would think that was fine. Well, it wasn't fine. You could see men coming in, mostly men, I don't remember any women, with their hands shaking, and they were with withdrawal. They lost all their money, and they were looking for more credit. And you could just see that they were digging a deeper and deeper hole. And so I had real concerns, and I had legislation that helped establish the Council on Compulsive Gambling, which I think is still doing business today. That they needed to tighten the credits. Credit was, I thought, too readily available. You could get cash from something called ComCheck in the casinos and just keep going. So I think maybe that's. I think we're about out of time for this session, Chuck. We moved ahead on a lot of gambling issues, and we'll pick up there on the next episode.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share some of these great memories. I've really enjoyed this today, Dad, and I hope you have a great weekend as well.
Thanks, Chuck, and you and Helen do the same. Love you a lot. Appreciate your help.
Love you, Dad. Take care.